Hey, everyone, we have Carmine Gallo here. He's a best-selling author, keynote speaker, CEO advisor, Harvard instructor, and Publishers Weekly called you a communications guru, which is pretty awesome. I hope to one day be called a communication guru. Did I leave out taxidermist? Is that another one of your jobs there?
I think communication guru is something you don't want to call yourself. So I'm glad I'm glad a third party did.
Yeah, well, that's an awesome compliment, and that's.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is a great opportunity to speak to some of the students you have at Louisville.
University of Louisville, go Cards.
Yep. That's right, Cardinals, right? Cardinals basketball is a big deal.
That's right.
Yeah.
I wanted to move through some different topics and kind of get your feel for them.
Absolutely.
Maybe you can provide some insights. What's the difference between a good public speaker and a great public speaker?
You have 2 hours.
I know that's a pretty broad question.
10 books later, yeah, I think I'm arriving at a few common elements. Anyone can deliver a presentation, and anyone can put words to an idea and communicate. So a lot of people think that just because they can speak, they can communicate, or they can present well, and that's not the case, as all of your students know very well. There are a handful of people, and certainly not a majority, but in my experience throughout my career as a journalist and then as a writer and as a communication advisor, there are a handful of people who stand out in a way that captures a person's imagination and takes you on a journey where you want to be a part of that person's world or that person's journey, regardless of what they're selling too. I do a lot of work with the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. I live outside of the San Francisco Bay Area, so I'm close to Silicon Valley. And to a person, if you talk to venture capitalists or wealthy investors who put money behind startups, to a person, they say we don't always look at the numbers or the statistics or the forecasts because we know those are just best guesses. But if you can convince us that you're the type of person that we want to invest in, regardless of what you do, that's how you're going to win people over. They're few and far between, but I have found, like a Steve Jobs, I wrote my first book called The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, which became an international bestseller on public speaking and communication. It was primarily focused on delivering business presentations. And what I learned throughout that process and also years later is that Steve Jobs worked at it. That this is not just a natural skill that comes to people who are, say, naturally gregarious or who can speak in front of people. That's not it at all. Crafting a presentation and crafting an idea in a way that stirs other people to action and sparks their imagination and gets them excited, that's a different skill. And it is a skill that can be developed with practice and with a structure and with time. So the fact that you have students that are taking these courses, and frankly, I'm a little surprised. I think it's fantastic because not all universities offer such extensive programs in advanced communication. Those are the folks that are going to stand out professionally.
Yes, definitely. And that's what I really try to instill in all of my students. Adobe did a study recently. I don't know if you saw that. I'll forward it on to you. That shows that much of what hiring managers and companies are looking for are skills and qualities that are taught within the communication discipline. Things like,
look that up. I'm writing it down as we speak. I want that link.
And yes. I'll forward that on to you after this. But I post this study every single term that I teach and just let them know, you think these classes are these touchy-feely classes that you may never use this information again, but in fact, it's going to set you apart from other people. And yes, lots of people can learn technical knowledge, book knowledge, but it's those people that can truly teach and explain those are the ones that are going to be chosen and chosen over others to go and represent their company or for manager positions.
Can I give you an example? I'll give you an example, but first, let me tell you of a short anecdote that kind of changed the way I see communication and public speaking. Uh, you mentioned that a lot of people think this is a soft skill. And I use that term too, and that's what we often use that term, but it's not, as you know, and all your students know. It's certainly not a soft skill because, like the Adobe example, the hard evidence shows that this is not a soft skill at all. In fact, it's the one skill that can set you apart in any competitive environment. So I was speaking to the a head investor at Y Combinator. It's an under the radar investment firm. So you probably haven't heard of it, but if you look it up, you'll see it. They are the first firm that put seed money into Reddit, Airbnb. You know, those, you don't have Airbnb if you don't have Y Combinator. So I was speaking to the founder of Y Combinator, and we're having this discussion. And I'm talking about public speaking and communication skills. And then I made the mistake of saying, let's talk about storytelling in business. I know it's a soft skill. I dismissed it myself. I said, I know it's a soft skill. And he looked at me and said, well, that's not right. If you can't, if an entrepreneur cannot encourage me or inspire me to be an active participant in the journey that they've laid out, then I'm not interested and I'm not investing. And that product never makes it to market. The brand will never get, probably never get successful. So you say, and he's pointing to me, so you say storytelling is a soft skill. I call it fundamental. And it made an impression with me, Ashlee, because I'm the guy who writes about storytelling.
Yes.
I've written books on it. I'm a big believer. And yet I'm just used to considering it the softer skill. No, it's not. It's critical, and it sets people apart.
I agree. I agree 100%. I also wanted to see, so this is kind of left field, but if you could talk to your younger self, what advice do you think you would give yourself in terms of academics? And I mean, I have no idea what your major was or anything like that, but is there anything you would tell your younger self in terms of advice?
Yeah.
I'm sure in plenty of different areas.
As I get older, there are a million things I would tell my younger self, because I went to UCLA.
Mhm.
And then I went to Northwestern University for a master's degree because I wanted to get into um, journalism. So I'm glad I chose that path. And a lot of people say kind of follow your passion, and that's very important. But just kind of keep an open mind of where that passion will lead you.
Mhm.
I think that's very important, because when I'm glad I did one thing when I was at UCLA as an undergrad. I was taking political science. That was my major, with a minor in communication. And communication just fascinated me, and I loved speeches. I loved reading great speech makers. So it was really fascinating. And rather than kind of go into the field that my parents wanted me to go to, they were Italian immigrants. So you're either a doctor or a lawyer. You got to, yeah, you got to
Yeah.
be one of the two.
Yeah.
But I made the decision, and it was hard at the time. Rather than go into that field, into law, and I was pre-law at the time, I left, and after I graduated, I got a master's degree in journalism, and then I went into broadcast journalism for a long time, and then I left that career as well, because there's only so many fires and controversies you can cover. I mean, at some point, it's kind of depressing, because that's by definition what the news covers, all the bad
Mhm.
news, right? But I didn't realize it at the time, and I was really stuck in journalism for a long time. I think it was 15 years. Uh, and now what I'm doing now for the last 10 or 15 years has been so much more satisfactory because I've got my own business and I write, and I work with executives from all over the world. And up until COVID, I was traveling all over the world. So hopefully that'll
Yes.
come back soon. But I was locked in. It's like, oh no,
Mhm.
I studied to be a journalist and that's what I'm doing. So for 15 years, I just kind of went from town to town and eventually to CNN in New York. And I started covering business news. That opened up a whole new world for me, which was fantastic and led me to where I am today. But
Mhm.
I think I was a little too hyper focused on, well, this is my passion. This is what I studied for. And I didn't allow myself to kind of let my passion guide me on different roads and be a little more flexible with what's coming in.
Mhm.
So I think that's definitely one of the follow the passion, but also keep all roads open because you don't know how the world is going to work out where you can still use your skills
Yes.
in a way that you had never imagined. And the world is changing so rapidly that what you're studying for today may not be that relevant 2 or 3 years from now, which is why, thank goodness, I did focus on communication skills early on. It's those communication skills that set people apart. And many people don't realize that until much later in their career. Because
Yes.
the folks who come to me, the CEOs, um, well, I'm not going to say CEOs. CEOs get it. The like mid-level managers, it's only when they get stuck in their careers that they reach out to people like myself and say, "Oh, I'm being told that I don't communicate that well, or I don't give presentations that good, or I don't inspire people, or I'm boring." You know, people will say that I'm just kind of dull. Uh, and what happens is that they're at this mid to upper level management. They got the skills. They have the skills to get there because they have very specific skills for a specific industry, and they don't realize till later or till they're told that if they can communicate and present better, it'll help them leapfrog their
Mhm.
peers. Uh, that's something that the earlier you learn, the better the better it is going to be for you in your career.
You'd mentioned COVID and what's going on now and the lack of travel. In terms of students, is there anything additional that you can suggest for them to do to set themselves apart now as they're trying to enter the job market? Because some of my students are going to be seniors this term, and I know some of my students are freaking out saying, how am I going to go interview? And that's why I really think this class, especially the fact that it's online, is so great. And that's what I'm trying to tell them is some of your interviews are going to take place online.
Mhm.
But is
Many
there,
of your interviews will take place online.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So those communication skills that you're learning now are going to be more valuable than ever, especially when it's online. Okay, so let me give you one example. This was not online, but it certainly applies. I'm going to give you one anecdote example of a young man who was in college at the time I met him. I met him maybe 7 years ago. So he's probably close to 30 now. This young man, Frank, had graduated from a university here in California and contacted me a few months after he got his first job. Don't know the person, contacted me out of the blue, just wanted to send an email to thank me for writing one of my books that he used to prepare for his interviews. I think it was Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, because this was before Talk Like TED. And so I contacted him. Tell me more. What happened? He said, "Well, I left college in a very tough job market. So this may have been." There was some recession in Silicon Valley. I don't think it was 2008, but there was a recession in Silicon Valley. They weren't hiring. A lot of the tech companies weren't hiring at that time. And he said, so I left. It was a really hard job market to get into, but I ended up getting a job on my like second or third interview,
Yeah.
even though other people were sending out a lot of resumes, getting a lot of interviews, but they weren't being hired. He said he got one on his like second interview, boom, just like that. And what they told him was, and I think he had like a liberal arts degree, so it wasn't, tech focused. But what they told him is something that has stuck with me for years, and it's something your students need to know today. They said, you explained our company and what we do and our products better than our own salespeople.
I love that.
Actually, once he got the job, someone from HR said, "Can we record you
Wow.
like giving that pitch and talking about the company so we could show the other salespeople how to do it?" And here's this young guy right out of college. The difference is because he prepared,
Mm.
just like you have to prepare for all of these virtual interviews.
Yes.
Practice in real time, practice on Zoom with a friend or a peer. Put yourself on a Zoom video, record yourself so you see how you're coming across and
Hmm.
how you're expressing yourself. Do you talk too much? Do you ramble? Uh, and practice those questions that you're likely to get. But more than that, understand the company and the product or the service in a way that explain it better than even the people at their own company. And that's how you're going to stand out.
Yes.
So this young man, fast forward to today. So this young man, I call him a young man, he must be now 30 or 29.
He's still
So this
young to
guy,
me.
yeah, me too. So this guy then goes on, contacts me 2 years later. I track this, because it's just such a great story. But he reflects 1,000 other people who I've talked to over the years, right? He just reflects a lot of young people. 2 years later, he wants to get into management. He wants to grow in technology. So he went through one of those coding camps. I bet your students are familiar with those. They're like online programs where you learn how to code, computer
Hmm.
coding. So he got a coding certificate, but he told me, Carmine, there's guys who have been coding since they were 10 years old. So my technical skills weren't that great. And yet he ended up getting a really good position at a big tech company that like doubled his salary as soon as he got that coding certificate. A lot of other people who had a lot more coding experience were still struggling for jobs for a long time. Why? Because he served as a translator. He could translate information to engineers and from engineers back to customers in a way that no one else could.
That's wonderful.
Because he could speak two languages.
Yes.
So now he elevates to management. He went to New York City, I believe, for a couple of years. And recently, I'm only telling you this because I heard from him recently. He left. He's one of those many people who are leaving the big cities right now. He left to another state, cheaper state. The company said, "We can't lose you." Even though they laid off people, we can't lose you.
Yes.
So they kept his salary and the benefits, and he went to a much cheaper state. He's going to buy a house. I mean, the guy is like doing really well. But he is the type of student who I've been following since he graduated college. And look at that career progression. Is it because of the skills or the experience he has? Those get him through the door, but it's the communication skills that set him apart.
That's right.
And he practiced, just like I'm suggesting to all the students today. You have to practice real world interview conditions. This man told me that he practiced once for like 8 hours before an interview, where he knew every potential question and he had great answers and great stories and examples to answer those questions. So he was confident, prepared, nothing could throw him because he had already been through the gauntlet. That is the way Steve Jobs used to prepare for a presentation. If you're going to give a mission critical presentation, you actually have to give it, deliver it, stand up in front of people. So you're nervous. Steve Jobs used to stand up in front of an empty auditorium with a handful of executives. And true story, because I know people who worked with Steve Jobs on presentation skills. So Steve Jobs would deliver presentations weeks ahead of time and practice every single day. And he would get into character. He got on stage and delivered the presentation. One person said that he raised his voice and he had these big hand gestures like he was giving it to thousands of people, but there were only 3 of us in the room. And then he would pause, lower his voice, look down at the executives and say, and ask, what could have been better? Could you read the slide? Was that a good demo? Could I have shortened it? Constantly getting that feedback, even at his level. That's the mark of a great communicator. constant practice, always learning and getting feedback, because as you know, we could all get better
Oh, yeah.
at public speaking or communication. All the great people who you've probably mentioned to in all your public speaking classes, the great orators of our time, going back to whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or today's contemporary business speakers, they practiced at it. They spent many years honing and sharpening a craft.
Mhm.
And so public speaking is a skill. And like any skill, it can be developed and sharpened with time and practice.
Well, and that's what I try to pass on to my students as well, is you watch these TED Talks and they just look
Yeah.
so effortless and just kind of like they're just having a conversation and they're just telling their story, but not realizing that they've told those stories, they've given those presentations 100 times practicing.
Funny you mentioned that. I have an example because I wrote Talk Like 10. I had to interview a lot of well-known TED speakers. Chris Hadfield is an astronaut. Your students may not know of him, but if you look him up, he was a social media. He went viral for a while when he was at the International Space Station because he sang, I think, David Bowie's Space Oddity on like a guitar on the space station. So
Yes,
the
I've seen that.
video went viral. He's a great speaker, and he has given TED Talks and also a lot of public presentations. Watch his TED Talk if you haven't. Recommend it to your class, because what you'll see is someone who speaks in metaphor. In order for him to explain what it is like to be shot off into space on the top of a rocket, is unlike anything you can experience, or unlike anything you can really visualize. So he uses a lot of metaphor and analogy to kind of bring it alive. And pretty soon you feel like you're in the rocket ship with him. He's extraordinary. So I think your students should watch that, especially when you get to the part on metaphor and analogy.
Yes. Yeah.
But before I get off track, so I'm talking to Hadfield, and I said, "Boy, you're terrific. You're just sensational. How did you learn to become a good speaker?" And he said, "Carmine, I've been doing this for 25 years. Since he became an astronaut, especially a Canadian astronaut, there's not many. He's had to do speaking for years, every week, schools, groups, organizations, conferences."
And you wouldn't think that.
So he's like, "Yeah, well, thank you for the compliment, but I've been doing it for 25 years."
Yeah.
And not one person I've ever interviewed, not one, who's considered a good speaker today, not one person said they were naturally, gifted at public speaking. They worked at it. In fact, many people who who you wouldn't realize, were terribly nervous public speakers. There were some that were downright terrified of public speaking.
Wasn't it
And
Warren Buffett?
Warren Buffett has a famous story. Well, it's famous to me. I don't know how well known it is. But Warren Buffett has a true story because he's told it several times. He was so terrified of speaking in public that he signed up for a public speaking course. It was like a Dale Carnegie course. And little known fact of that story, he signed up once and dropped out, lost his money. He even remembers, because he's got that brilliant financial mind. He remembers everything. It was $100 at the time. He said, "I lost my money," which was a lot back then. This was early on in his career. Lost my money because he didn't take the course because he was too afraid to get into a room and say his name out loud in front of people. So he was terrified, just terrified. And he got up the courage to do it again and again. And, finally took the course and he became a little better. But if Warren Buffett had not taken a public speaking course and tried to at least manage his fear of public speaking, he never would have become a stock advisor, because you have to solicit people to give you their money and so you can invest it. And you never would have heard of Warren Buffett, and he's given most of his fortune to the Gates Foundation. So all these good things kind of came out of it, but not if he had not taken a public speaking course to get over his public speaking anxiety. And to this day, Warren Buffett said the number one skill that you should be, and this was at an MBA course, he said this to MBA students. He said, all of you are learning Excel and you're learning spreadsheets and data. That's great. Number one skill you should be developing, those public speaking.
Yay. Yay.
Yay. So I know I'm telling you, the reason why I'm excited to talk to you is because I think your students are more ahead of the game than they think they are.
That's one thing leading into my next question. Do you think that there is a right way to practice?
Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrophysicist, obviously has a lot of experience with communication and communicating complexity like science. But he talks about writing first. You have to be a good writer first, because when you write, that's when everything you do, your presentations, you're delivering information that you've kind of written down first. So I like that whole idea of structuring everything on paper first, giving yourself those bullet points. Uh, I don't tend the way I practice is, and how I've advised other executives is, if you need to kind of get everything on paper first, go ahead and write it down first, because then you can work on the sentences. You can take complex sentences and make them shorter. You can let's start eliminating words. You could shorten words and phrases, or eliminate stories or examples that are too long. And for me, the easiest way of doing that is on paper first, on a Word document, writing it out, and then going through and deleting. I kind of go through it first, talk through it, maybe out loud, but then when I actually start rehearsing, that's when I cut it down to bullet points. So I
Mhm.
only see a few words. And that way you get more used to, making that eye contact and delivering that information direct, and making those connections with people. But I like to start with a written outline first and then reduce every time I practice. I practice in front of people, or standing up out loud with bullet points in front of me. And that way I could just glance down and then make eye contact. And pretty soon, you do that about 10 times if you're actually delivering a real presentation. And I don't have to look at my notes at all, right? So I'm engaged, I'm making eye contact. But I like this idea, and it's an idea that I've only started writing about in the last few years because I learned it from professional athletes. I like this idea of practicing under pressure.
Mhm.
And maybe you've talked about that, but this idea that you can't just practice to yourself. You can't just practice, looking through your notes or your slides and mentally going over your notes. No, practicing out loud or on a real Zoom call with someone else, with people actually watching you, or recording your Zoom call, or someone on the other end, because that way it gets you very comfortable with the scenario that you'll actually be doing, which is in front of real people. So
Hmm.
that's why people tend to kind of get nervous. I've talked to professional golfers about this, right? Professional golfers like to bet even on 2-foot putts, and they do that to put pressure on themselves. They have to play these little mind games, because when they're actually in competition, and that 2-foot putt means that you've got your PGA card for the rest of the year, or it means a lot of money. Uh, you get nervous, and you
Yes.
get nervous when you haven't been in that situation. And so other scholars who talk about how to gain confidence in any skill where it's a performance, they talk about this fact that you should be practicing in real world type of conditions. And so that's kind of changed my approach to practicing in the past few years, or at least what I try to recommend to people.
But
Practice in real world conditions.
and I also like, but getting back to what you were saying too, I love how you say that each time you practice, you condense the wording even more.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times students have a hard time with that condensing of the wording. So if they're just taking a little piece each time they practice, it's not going to be as scary in some ways.
Yeah, every time you have to give yourself a time limit. Do you impose time limits on students? I think that's really
Yes.
important. Yeah, so that's the magic of TED. A TED Talk is only 18 minutes.
Mhm.
And a lot of TED speakers, I've worked with some TED speakers, and I've also heard from TED coaches, and to a person, they say, well, 18 minutes, that's too little time. No, that's all you got. That's all we gave Bill Gates. That's all you get. Oh,
Mhm.
but 18 minutes too. How can I, and one person said, how can I take 40 years of scholarly research and condense it into 18 minutes? And they told him, well, you don't. Just give us one big idea. What a great tip.
Yes.
That's it. Give us one big idea. We don't want to hear your 40 years of scholarly research. Give us one big idea. And you can do
Yes.
that in 18 minutes. But that time limit is, I impose that time limit on everyone I work with too, because the time limit forces you to condense, which is why most PowerPoints are really bad and really boring. And all of your students are familiar with the long, boring PowerPoint presentations because there's no real time limit. And so people just kind of ramble and they
Mhm.
fill out page after page, slide after slide of bullet points and text. And it just keeps going on and on. And what those speakers don't realize is that after about 10 minutes or so, your audience is already bored, even if it's a good presentation. There's some science that people tend to tune out after about 10 minutes. So how are you going to engage them? You're not going to engage them by doing another 30 minutes of the same thing. So
Mhm.
this whole idea of condensing ideas, condensing your sentences, and making that limited time heavy on story and emotion and content and making it rich with imagery, all of those advanced skills that you folks are learning, that's a critical skill.
Well, and that leads us into the discussion of eloquence.
Okay.
And that's what I really, for the advanced level courses, that's what I really want to get into is really crafting your wording and thinking about, and this goes along the lines of authenticity too. You mentioned that in your book, where being authentic takes work. So, for instance, if you were going to sit back and you were going to write the story of your life, you wouldn't just put down this big long stream of consciousness of whatever goes in. You would craft it and you'd really think about exactly what you want to tell about yourself and how you want to tell it. And I think that that goes along with it's in the same wheelhouse as eloquence. So
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, which is a definitely an acquired skill.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
but it can be done. You mentioned, so eloquence and authenticity. So you mentioned authenticity. And eloquence. That's why I believe that people should learn to tell stories and that people should use personal stories because stories connect with people emotionally, and it's the way to deliver a lot of information in a way that's more vivid, and that connects with people in a deeper, more meaningful way. So I'm a big believer in helping people elicit the personal stories behind an idea or a product or their vision. What's the personal story behind it? You'll find, and most of your students will find that when they enter the business world, they most people tend not to tell their personal story. They tend to keep that kind of reserved because they think it's all about the PowerPoint slides and the data. And what they miss, and they're going to learn, they'll learn it later, unless they've taken these kind of courses, is that it's the personal stories that connect you with your listeners. So I'm a big believer in authenticity through personal story connection.
yes. And
Yeah.
and actually in my class, that's what I want them to do for one of their speeches. I want them to include a story in there, and I want them to tell me, there's a little assignment that I'm going to have them do. What is the purpose of this story? So it's not just to bring this story in, but what is its purpose? What are you hoping to gain by telling this story? The other thing that I really want them to do,
Yeah.
they have to do a group presentation.
Hmm.
I want each of them to present from a slide that is just an image, either one word or an image, kind of like the whole Steve Jobs thing. I want
Yeah.
them to be able to present without relying on exactly what's on that PowerPoint, what's in those bullet points. I want them to be able to know that. And I mentioned that to my husband. He's chair of a department in Tennessee. And he said, well, that's a very advertising and marketing thing to do. And I said, well, it's just good public speaking.
Yeah.
So that's what I really want them to do, is I want them to hone in on, like you said, storytelling and being able to be the storyteller, not relying on that PowerPoint to do it for them.
Let me give you three examples on that topic. Okay. So one is Amazon Jeff Bezos. Maybe you guys have already talked about this. 2 years ago, Bezos sent out a newsletter, and he said that he has banned PowerPoint in Amazon. I've worked with different departments at Amazon. So technically it's not banned completely internally, but when you enter C-suite and you have to present Bezos and his C team with uh, something you're working on, whether it's an initiative within Amazon or a new product or a new feature for the website or for the cloud computing, which is a big part of their business, he does not want to see a PowerPoint. I don't know if you've heard this. Have you heard this story of why he doesn't want? No, so he doesn't want to see a PowerPoint. He wants a story. He wants a 6-page, which is an extensive story. He wants to see a memo where he can sit down, and it has to be sent out ahead of time, and read it like a story. Like, take me through a customer journey. How would a customer actually be using this particular product or service or your idea? He wants, and he said, I want them in full sentences, full paragraph. I want to read the story. I don't want to see a PowerPoint, because PowerPoint doesn't tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why this whole idea of telling the story out of one image, that's also a critical skill. Steve Jobs, and I only learned this recently, Steve Jobs used if I get this right, 190-point font. 190-point font. And this was from Guy Kawasaki, who used to work with Steve Jobs, and he's a marketing guy. So I had a conversation with Guy Kawasaki, and he goes, yeah, Steve Jobs used to use a 190-point font. and I said, well, that's amazing. Why? I knew the font was large. I didn't know it was 190 point. He goes, because you can only get one word or a picture on the slide.
Wow.
He goes, who wants to read a bunch of bullet points? It's, so again, this whole idea of what you're doing is really valuable. Get them to address one slide with one word on it, or one picture, or one photo. And look at the TED Talks. Show me a TED Talk that is viral, that is successful, that's been seen 40 million times. Show me a TED Talk that is successful, that has PowerPoint and bullet points on it. Every slide has an image or a word or two, not the tradition. And yet what happens when we get into corporate America? You know exactly what happens. The slides all look the same, and there's 100 slides, and they're all text and bullet points. So if you walk in and you do something just a little different, and you go into it structuring a story and making it more interesting, that's how you'll stand out. Your audience won't even know why they like it so much, but they know it's different. We'll know, but the audience doesn't.
Well, thank you so much. I just appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. When are you going to show the students?